Good afternoon, ladies, and thank you very much for attending the first lecture of the 34th Chen Lecture in History and Culture of New Asia College. Today's lecture is jointly organized by the Department of History and New Asia College. We are extremely honored to have invited Professor Nicholas Standard, Professor of Sinology, University of Leuven, Belgium, to give us a talk on joining the global public in the early and mid-Qing dynasty, the Chinese Gazette in European sources. We are also very delighted to have Professor Leung Yun Sun, Emeritus Professor, Department of History of CUHK, to be the moderator of this lecture. So without further delay, I will now pass over to Professor Leung to introduce the speaker and start the lecture today. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon. A very warm welcome to you all who are here for our face-to-face or in-person lecture for about 3 years. Professor Nick, a well-renowned sinologist in Belgium, has been nominated as our distinguished Chen Wu lecturer 4 or 5 years ago. That was a long time ago. But then because of the pandemic and because of all this restriction, and then I have him person today to deliver 3 years about cross or intercultural and actually the area who is a leading scholar in West cultural. He has done much research on the Jesuits in the problems they encountered. In fact, I think the first book of Yang Tingyun was published in the 80s. At that time, when I was doing research on another Chinese scholar, Li Zizao. So maybe a few years earlier. So in the end, I think I published only an article on Li Zizao and how he dealt with the Jesuits. Professor Standard, I think, a thick book on Yang Tingyun, the Buddhist turned Catholic, turned Christian. So we share a lot of, research interest, in common. I'm glad here for New Asia Chen ship for a week, maybe a little week. Professor Standard's recent project, print culture. We have graduate students, colleagues who are interested in print culture. In fact, at the library, I think this week, a grand exhibition on the manuscripts written by European Jesuits and also Chinese scholars during that time. So after this, you can go ahead and to our main library and also rights and controversy. I think he has written a book, and also of interaction or intercultural exchange, especially the concept of in between. I think which we share also as an interest in cultural history. Now, without much ado, I will pass the time and the stage to Professor Nicholas Standard for the list of his publications and his awards and honors. Please read the booklet with time to.
So good afternoon to everybody. Thank you for the very kind introduction. In the first place, I would like to express my very sincere thanks to the head of the New Asia, to the Dean Faculty of History, to Professor for today. I feel extremely honored to have been elected by the lecturers. We have to wait every year. I'm very happy to say that I cherish this very much, and or because I cherish also the Chinese University of Hong Kong. I do not say this simply by kind of politeness. First time I came here was in 1982. I went to mainland China, in Fudan, and I was 1 week before here in Hong Kong, and I visited the city. And then in the early 90s, working here at China News Analysis, and so I often came to the library, and later on I had several occasions to come here for conferences. And for me, this always has been an extremely fruitful occasion for encounter, exactly the type of encounters that I dream of or that I do research on in my own field of studies. Professor Leung already mentioned that I was, or I'm still interested, among other things, in print culture. And so I wanted to investigate how in the intercultural contact between China and Europe, how important the role of print culture was, because the missionaries came here and they did have to bring a printing press because everything was present in China. And within that context, I was just wondering, did the missionaries read the official gazette? And I thought, oh, I will spend maybe 1 or 2 weeks on that topic because there will not be a lot of material. And then I moved to another topic. But I spent 3 years on that topic. And that's what I would like to present today. And thanks, I would say, thanks to COVID, I could even publish a book about it. So it will be in the context, the topic basically will be a presentation or a re-articulation of my latest book. So here, that's the cover of the book. It's published by Brill, and you see the different chapters, but I'm not going through all the different chapters today. Let me first, as a kind of introduction, point out that there recently, in the last few years, the last 20, 30 years, there has been a renewed interest in this topic of the Gazette, what we call the Gazette, the Dibao, often called Jingbao. I come back on that term a bit later. And there are also other terms with kind of nuances, Chaopao, and so on and so on. So you see a number of Chinese scholars who have been investigating that topic, especially the series by Fang Hanqi and other scholars, and some of his students who also made their dissertation on that topic. And also in the West, there have been several studies on the Gazette. And as Mokros points out, there have been different approaches. You can study it from the point of view of the press, history of the press, or the history of the state, how a Gazette can work at state building, or the history of information in society, how it is circulating. So among these recent publications, you see the different types. You had Barbara Mittler on the history of the press, and then you have Hilde de Weert on the Song Dynasty, and that's more the information. And then the latest book also by Emily Mokros, that is more the late imperial China. And in fact, after 1800, our information about the Gazette is quite extensive, also in terms of translations, because there have been a lot of translations of it. And in Brill, you have even a whole website with 8,500 pages that is online and that you can consult in that regard. The point is that before 1800, the gazettes that are left over are extremely few. Basically, it's only from the Qianlong period. And as you know, Qianlong, it's 60 years of reign. And you only have about 394 copies of the Gazette left over. So that means a little bit more than 1.5 years. By comparison, we should not exactly make the comparison, but you have European gazettes from or newspapers from before 1800. You have sometimes complete sets. But in China, it is rather limited. And even here, what is called the Tipao from the Yongzheng period, it's not really a Tipao. So what is then the problem? The problem is that scholars, actually also, we project the name and the knowledge we have about the Gazette from beyond or after 1800. We project that on the earlier period. And we use the name, Jingpao, and we use the concept and the format and so on the time before. Or another way, like for instance, Hilde Douay, where we check secondary sources, for instance, the diaries, the notebooks, the novels, to see what information is caught in it on the Gazette. For instance, we know on the basis on a Piki that someone 3 or 4 months later than the death of Matteo Ricci says, I read in a Pao the death of Matteo Ricci. And that's a very indirect information. So my question was, can we find some information about the Gazette in Western sources? It's not a preference for Western sources because I mainly work on Chinese sources, but that was my simple question. And can we even find maybe some of the pre-1800 Chinese versions also in European libraries? So extremely simple question. I'm not the first, as some other people have been working on it as well. So in terms of methodology, and there you see the types of methodology that I try to use, is the concept of looking at a culture from the periphery. I adopt the concept from the Institute of Fudan Daxue, the Wenshe Yanqiu Yuan. Ge Zhaoguang has already published about that. So let us look at Chinese history from the point of view of European sources or sources that are hidden in European libraries. But it can, and you will also see that I also used some Korean sources for it. And moreover, maybe these sources not only inform us about China, but also about how Europeans who lived in China read these sources, how was their reaction, what did they do with it, and so on. Moreover, another concept is this so-called interconnected history, is to see, once we have these sources, to what extent is this Jingpao, is this Tipao connected and used, for instance, also in Europe? Did European, and I'm not talking about the European missionaries in China, but did European intellectuals, savants, use these sources? So these were my basic research questions. First, a final point in terms of methodology. So I've discovered quite a number of European sources. The first point then is, what is the information in these European sources? Is that correct information? In order to know that, I should have access to the Chinese sources, which I do not have. So what I did kind of bypass, namely, this is the Tipao, and then you have European manuscripts, and some of these European manuscripts were published. And the problem is that we don't have the original Tipao, except for about 8. I come back on that later. So I bypassed it, and I tried to identify the records in the Sholu to see what was mentioned in this Gazette maybe appears in the Sholu. But the Sholu is not the basis of the Tipao, because the Sholu is published or written much later. And the Tipao was usually a few days after the event with the emperor. They published or they wrote, or maybe 1 month later, but the Sholu is historically much later. So what are the basis of the Shelu and of the Tipao, that are the Qituju and the Shangyu. So when I had a record in the Shelu, I tried to find it in the Qituju and the Shangyu. And then I could check whether it was the right origin. So very concretely, you see a manuscript here, and then you can see, for instance, that's in French, C1 5600. And so then I tried with the databases, and so I found a record with the names. This is French translation, pinyin of that time. And then I could find it in the Qituju and in the Shangyu Dang. You have the same with printed sources. This is a reference to, for instance, He Sheng, the famous minister He Sheng, and so, and the same kind of events. So in my book, you will find about 60 pages with the identification of more than 300 items found in this way. So you can say the originals are not left. The originals, the Tipao are not left. We have the Chinese versions of it, and we have the translation in European sources, so that to a certain extent already expands our knowledge of what appeared in these in this Tipao at that time. So let me now move to the topic itself, and we start with, or I will focus mainly on the Yongzheng period, and I will tell you something about the production, and then about the distribution, and then about reception. So first about production. What is one of the major sources to European sources are the so-called lettres édifiantes et curieuses. That's an enormous series. And in the lettres édifiantes et curieuses, there are 3 letters by Circonstance, who is not very well known. Basically, he has no writing in Chinese and hardly anything in French, except these 3 letters. And that's about 300 pages. And they are basically only devoted to the Gazette. So what do we find in this? And you can see that was in 1726 that it was written. So what do we find in these letters? In the first place, he gives a description of what is the content of a Gazette. And you see here the list. He says, you will find the names of officials, criminal cases, expenses made, admonitions, rituals performed, and so on and so on. Very nice, because if you look at modern publications, you will basically find the same list. So he has a very good record of what was the content. As I mentioned here again, I try to identify all the different sources, and they are quite extensive. And if you want to know what is he translating, here you have a few examples. So that can be the end of 3-year mourning and installation of the empress, a text about a memorial archway, something rescue the people in years of bad harvest, to relieve the poor, a death sentence, and so on. So a wide range of topics. These are, as you can notice, they are not related to Christianity at all. He also gives information about the structure of the Tipao. So, and that corresponds well with what we know about these early Tipaos. Namely, you first have the Lunyin, and then the Shangyu, and then the Zhe, and then the Tizhou. I come back on that later. And how can we prove it, or how can we find whether that corresponds? In fact, so far, I only found one copy of what was the Tipao during the Yongzheng period. And that is this text that is in the Österreichische Nationalbibliothek in Vienna. As you can see, the title is not Tipao. The title is not Qingpao. Qingpao is much later. It is Tizhou Chuanlu. Do we know whether that is the correct title at that time? I checked many databases, the Jiaolong database and so on. You will not find it. Only in Korean sources. You have this Yen Xinglu. These are the delegates, the yearly delegates from Korea going to Beijing, and they stay there for 1 or 2 months, and then they go back and they write a report. And they have several records saying, in the Tizhou Chuanlu of today, it is mentioned this and this and this and this. And there is a note in the text, original note from that time, saying that this is 跟我们的草报一样. It's the same as our official newspaper. Maybe we have a second copy, and that's the glass here in the Musée National d'Histoire Naturelle de Paris. They have a collection of minerals, and these minerals are in boxes, or in this is closed, has never been opened, and you see some of these characters. And so we guess that this may be a copy that they are wrapped in one paper or so of the Tipao. So they have not yet decided whether they want to open it or not, but let us hope that they open it, and then we have a further confirmation. You see how detective work it implies to find your sources. Now, why do we know that this is really the Gazette of that time? Well, in fact, there is this important article by Pan Tianzhen, who already pointed out that during the Qianlong period, the most important, the Tipao or Qingpao, it was called Tizhou Shitian. Shitian here has the meaning of documents. The documented or the Tizhou, the memorials, they are documentation. And it's only much later that the term Qingpao was really used. And in Paris, we have, from the Qianlong period, we have 8 Osdiv copies. And you can see there is also the handwriting, and this is the handwriting of the missionary, and we have the French version of the text as well. And so the Tizhou Chuanlu is the forerunner of the Tizhou Shitian. This is this one is earlier, and that's why it is the forerunner of the Tizhou Shitian. The Tizhou Chuanlu is the forerunner of the Tizhou Shitian. Okay, so this is for the material side of the story. So furthermore, Contensin has information about the significance of the Gazette. Namely, he says, what makes the Gazette of China very useful for the government is that instead of filling it, as is done in certain parts of Europe, with useless things, and often with slander and calumny, it only mentions what relates to the emperor. This is very early, and we will see this remark repeated again. So they start to compare that with the European gazettes or newspapers at that time. And moreover, it points out that this is a very good means to instruct the people and the officials. Moreover, he says, it really should report what is said and what is done by the emperor. And then he has a very small sentence, and you will see how important this sentence will become. He writes, last year, 2 writers were sentenced to death for having inserted in the Gazette some circumstances which were false. The emperor went in the Yuan, and he had a meeting with some of the officials, and then they write that he went on the boat and that they got drunk and they had a whole feast, and that was reported. And then the emperor said, no, that is not true, and so on. And so they were condemned to death. But you see, it's only a small sentence, which fortunately I could identify in the original sources, but that will become very important for what follows. Finally, he has some personal explanation saying that, this kind of gazette is very useful for the missionaries they really should read it. And I spent already 20 years in China, and I didn't do that before, but now I regret it, because you find so much information about religion and laws and customs and language and so on and so on. And so he also mentions, yet the European missionaries has always neglected this reading because they do not know enough the language, or because they associate it with Europe, where anything is put in it, good and bad, without any distinction. And that's why they don't read it. So interesting remarks to see their feelings about it. So this was the first case, but that's already 300 pages. And then there is another case, and these are manuscript sources that are kept in the Propaganda Fide, the archives of the Propaganda Fide in Rome. And what is particular here, so this person is living in Canton about the same time, and they have copied by hand some complete Tipao. So that's very precious for us, because there you have not the original version, but the original Chinese text, and also translated into Italian. So they also give information about the content and about the form. There are some differences, because Contensin, he addresses it to an individual. Contensin addresses it to an individual so that he can publish it, whereas Peroni has the internal report, and that was never published. It was not spread anywhere, and it's also quite unique because of the Chinese text. So he also has the same personal considerations. He says, nor is there any danger that the story will be altered by the passion of the writer. And so he insists on the same point. It is a report about what the emperor says, and the authors of the compilers of the Tipao are not allowed to change it. So is there any difference, or what can we see? Because on one hand, they are reporting about all this, but there is also a vision that appears from behind. And so Contensin, he writes also about the emperor, and despite the persecution of Christianity, he has a quite laudatory description of the emperor, on the Yongzheng emperor. So he mentions that it is a wise government, that the emperor is in service of public utility, that there is an active bureaucracy, and we have to point out that this view is not necessarily shared by all the other missionaries or Jesuit missionaries, but he is very positive about it. Peroni, he has a more mixed view, because despite the persecution, he also has a positive view on the emperor and the bureaucracy. He says that the emperor is good as lecturing, and that he holds speeches to reproach his officials, that he is attentive to the needs of the people, that the bureaucracy is in communication with the emperor, and so on and so on. And so on one hand, quite positive, but he also has a negative view, more nuanced. He says that the emperor is blinded by his officials, that in his speeches, are disconnected from reality, that there is famine, but he doesn't know anything about it. His blindness results in the cruel persecution of Christianity, and the bureaucracy is always flattering the emperor. And so that's a more nuanced vision about it. So as a first, this was the presentation, as a first kind of small conclusion, what can we say? Well, on the one hand, looking at from the periphery to the sources, we get to know something about the material side, about how was it constituted, and so on and so on. And also, we know something about the content of these sources. So now these sources arrived in Europe. We mentioned that Peroni's manuscript was not this, but the lettres édifiantes were public and they were published. So the question is, how far what happened with this text? So here we can look at academic journals and newspapers and also some books. So in Europe at that time, there were academic journals. Two famous journals are, you can find fully online, Le Journal des Savants and also Les Mémoires de Trévoux. And what is typical for these academic journals is that they make very long reviews of publications with a lot of excerpts. So this is a new way of distributing the same knowledge. And we find in them extensive quotes from these letters. So the letters or the knowledge about the Gazette is spread more widely than only by the lettres édifiantes et curieuses. You have also some newspapers or some pamphlets. This is a book, a newspaper called The Bee Revived. And in it, you find again the reference to the Public Gazette. And also, they are the reverse of European newspapers. And you find the reference to two writers that were condemned to death. So that apparently was an important aspect. Another publication is Description de la Chine, 4 volumes, where it's an enormous source of information about China. And there is a whole chapter on the Chinese government. And you can see this book was published in French, but also in English, in Russian, in German. And you have a whole section on the Gazette. Nothing is inserted in the Gazette, but what has reference to the government. It's aimed at instructing the officials. And again, a reference to our 2 writers who were condemned to death. More information? Yes, at that time, there were some books on Chinese and world history. For instance, Histoire générale de la Chine. This is a collection, it's one work published in 13 volumes, more than 7,000 pages. As you probably know, in European languages, you have the Cambridge History of China, and that's about the largest collection about Chinese history in English at this moment. I think there are 150 scholars who worked on it. This work is published by one person. Translation from Chinese and from Manchu. And in fact, it's still the largest work on Chinese history published by one person since the 16th or 17th century. And again, you have a whole section. And they used that information for the Yongzheng period. They used the information from the Gazette. Another work is also Marcy, Histoire moderne des Chinois, again using these sources. So what can we say about this distribution? And here I refer to Jürgen Osterhammel, who wrote and writes, Europe was well informed about the Gazette and about events in China. Well, I'm writing that, but then the sentence from Osterhammel is, around the mid-18th century, the public in France and Germany was better informed about China than about many countries on Europe's periphery. So that's quite interesting to know. They were informed by these sources. And what is typical for that time is that Osterhammel who extensively shows that these sources are based on original Chinese text. And of course, when you translate, there is also always interpretation. But there was a kind of attempt to let the sources speak for themselves. So to say, you want to know something about China, Duhalde also writes that. Well, the best way is that we translate Chinese sources. And that's what happens also with the Gazette. And as you probably know, in modern scholarship, we tend to analyze and to criticize and so on, which is also a very interesting approach. But there is certain difference between that time and between our times. Description de la Chine, for instance, it's and Mémoire concernant les Chinois, on which I will come back. It's very impressive how many texts, in fact, were translated directly from Chinese. So this was the distribution. The next question is, but how was this information received? In fact, yeah, when you have it already in description or in this, it's already a way of receiving. But how can we have very explicitly reception of this information about the Gazette? And here we can look at the Enlightenment thinkers, Voltaire, Montesquieu, Quesnay, and another text on which we come back. First is Voltaire. Voltaire is, of course, one of the most important Enlightenment thinkers. And what is interesting is that Voltaire wrote a lemma on the Gazette in the very famous Encyclopédie de Diderot. And that's the famous encyclopedia of Enlightenment thinking. So the section on the Gazette is written by Voltaire. And what does he write? He says, well, where comes the Gazette from? That comes from Italy, from Venice, the name at least, where you had to pay for one piece of paper with some news, a Gazzetta. That was a coin. And then he adds, yes, but such journals have been established in China from time immemorial, and the Gazette of the Empire is printed every day by order of the court. So immediately joins the Chinese information in the Encyclopédie de Diderot. So the first question is, did Voltaire read the sources that we have seen so far? We have proof of it. Why? Because the library of Voltaire, after his death, was bought by Katerina from Russia and brought to St. Petersburg. And in the 70s and the 80s, the Russian scholars were not allowed to do, let's say, reflective work. So they did a lot of editing work. And they published the collections with all the notes in the books of Voltaire. So you have them directly access to it. And then I contacted them. And here you can see, these are the paper slips in the books, in the work, Lettres édifiantes et curieuses. And we can see the notes that he made regarding the Gazette. Like in this case, and here you have another case that he's mentioning, and that's handwriting of Voltaire. So we know that he read these sources. So what does he write about the Gazette? In his most famous book, Essai sur les mœurs et l'esprit des nations, that book is very, very important in terms of history, because Voltaire, that's a world history, and instead of putting the Middle East and the place of where Christ and Abraham and Isaac and so were, no, he puts China first. He says that was the most ancient country at that time. And he has reference to the Gazette. The Journal of the Chinese Emperor is the most authentic and useful newspaper in the world, since it contains the details of all the public needs, resources, interest of all the orders of the state. And so he gives a lot of information, or he uses a lot of information about the Chinese government, the imperial system, and so on. And what happens is that Voltaire is thinking about what is the ideal government, and he uses this information of China to construct his own view on the ideal government, and not on China itself, but on the ideal government in his idea. So he writes, the new emperor surpassed his father in the love of laws and the public good. No emperor encouraged agriculture more. And there is a whole dispute in France. the different types of government, and you have among them the despotic government, and you have a monarchy and a despotic government and so on. And so they discuss whether China is a despotic government or not. And so according to Voltaire, there is no evidence of a despotic or arbitrary government because you have a monarch who governs relying on subordinated administrative boards. And so he praises the examination system and how everything acts through the system of the bureaucracy. And so that's his opinion about it. We move to Montesquieu. In my book it's much longer, but I just give a few ideas about it. Montesquieu, we have again the same references, whether to as a proof that he read the Lettres édifiantes et curieuses. So, and that's in the manuscript, the Geographica. He is the opposite view in this discussion. He uses it as an argument also regarding the ideals of a governance, and he points out at the limits of the juridical system. So he writes the following: the author praises the Gazette. The author, that means Combeferre, the author of the Lettres édifiantes et curieuses, praises the Gazette of Peking, printed every day. Nothing is put into it that has not been presented to the emperor. We have seen these sentences before. And then he writes, 2 writers were published with that for putting false circumstances. The judgment of the tribunal was founded on the fact that they had been disrespected the emperor, which is a capital crime. And then comes the remark by Montesquieu: nothing so dangerous as these vague laws. The disrespect is an arbitrary thing. So he is very much opposed to an arbitrary juridical system. And so he uses that case. You remember that was just one sentence in the 300 pages, and that is always repeated over and over again to make his own argument. So he writes in Esprit des Lois, if the crime of high treason be indeterminate, this alone is sufficient to make the government degenerate in an arbitrary power. So he is of the opinion that China is a despotic state whose principles are to fear. And so that's an opposite view than Voltaire. And then we have Quesnay, which is an other thinker, Enlightenment thinker, so-called physiocrat, and physiocrat that refers to those who are interested in especially agriculture, the agricultural economy. China was really a model for agricultural economy at that time for European thinkers. And he has a whole text on the despotisme de la Chine. But as you will see here, the name of despotism is different than under Montesquieu, because he speaks about a legitimate despotism, namely where the legitimacy is manifested both in the moral and economic laws of the emperor and in their control of absolute power. So he advocated the Chinese meritocratic selection of officials instead of the French aristocratic system. He says we in France, we have this aristocracy, and look at China, they have an examination system. This is not a barbarian government. Its fundamental constitution was entirely independent from the emperor. So that's their view, and you see how they are debating among each others, not in the first place about China, partly about China, but about their own view on what could be a good government, and using the Chinese case, which as source are the information about the gazettes that were transmitted. And here again, you have the case of the two writers. The two writers were sentenced to death for having inserted facts that were false. So the law of China in China permits the practice of remonstration of the emperor. So he also uses another case where he says there is perhaps no country where the sovereign can be remonstrated with more liberty than in China. So this is the opinion of Quesnay at that time. I come to the fourth case. This is no longer thinkers, the French thinkers of the Enlightenment, but the first freedom of press and expression act in Europe. That was a Swedish act voted by the parliament in 1766. And there were two scholars, members of the Swedish parliament, and they wanted to submit a law to protect the freedom of writing, freedom of written expression, and freedom of the press. And they had to find some arguments. And where did they find their arguments? In Description de la Chine, the arguments were the Chinese Gazette. And they said, we have to do like in China, because in China you have the freedom of the press. And we have to adopt that, and that's why we have to vote this law. And this is what happened. The freedom of writing, of the press, and of the information had been in existence in China since ancient times, and had contributed substantially to the wealth and stability in China. So these are texts from that time where they say, and we have to do that, and that's how in Europe you had the first law on the freedom of writing and of the press. So, as you can see, you have different opinions. This is the reception. They base themselves on the information from the gazettes. These are the same sources. Voltaire and Quesnay have a rather positive view on it. Montesquieu is negative view. And the two parliament members of Sweden, they use it actively to promote the freedom of the press. I quote again Osterhammel, who says, very often we have been talking about Europe, you have the xenophobia, the xenophilie, with those who like China, who reject China. And he says, yeah, the objection that China was an idealized in xenophile text, which drew their information mainly from the Description de la Chine, may be correct, but misses the point. He says, the Chinese bureaucracy in the first half of the 18th century was indeed perhaps the best functioning in the world. And part of this bureaucracy was the Gazette. So they said, yeah, but here you have a real official Gazette with the official decisions that we do not have in the same way in Europe at that time. Moreover, reports on the Middle Kingdom gave European theorists the first opportunity to come to grips in a detailed way with the problems of administration and governments. And that's what I've been pointing out. Namely, it's through these translations, through the information about the gazettes, that this information allowed them to think about what could be an ideal government, and this kind of dialogue that was taking place. Before coming to a conclusion, I just mentioned very briefly also the Qianlong period. In my book, I have maybe 50 or 60 pages about it, but I want just to mention, there is still so much more information, especially about the Qianlong period. You have the series Mémoires concernant les Chinois. That's in total 15 volumes, in which you have all these translations of text. In it, you find 300 pages on the notion of xiao, only based translations of Chinese text. Till now, the largest treatise on xiao in any European language. And in it, you will find a lot of information also, translations and descriptions of the Gazette. These were sent by Amiot, a Jesuit in Beijing. He worked together, we have the name of the Chinese with whom he worked together, because many of these sources were produced in collaboration with Chinese scholars. And he sent that to Bertin. Bertin was state's minister, and they had about 30 years of correspondence, and so they sent information, and he was asking information, and they sent all this information back. And among that information sent to Europe were these few pages of the Tizo Chrétien that are in the National Library in Paris. And I just want to make reference to this. It's about the Sekou Chuanchu. So at that time, Europeans knew exactly, well, or had access to information about the whole production of the Sekou Chuanchu. And they translate parts of the Tizo Chrétien, in which it is said that two children of the Qianlong emperor, they were among the correctors, but if they make mistake, or if they did not correct a mistake, they should be punished in the same way as all the others. And the emperor regularly took a few copies of the transcriptions, and then he checked whether there were no mistakes, and if there were mistakes, they were punished, and so on. All this is in the Gazette, and it is can be found in the French sources. Moreover, Bertin says, yeah, and I talked about it with the French king, and he found it was so interesting. And the king has read all the extracts of the gazettes with pleasure. Of course, this is a small note, but you see that they exchange about it. And Bertin writes, oh, but this collection of the Sekou Chuanchu is really very interesting. We should have one. Can we ask them to give us a copy? And in exchange, we can give them tapestries and gobelins and mirrors. I take this as an example on how open-minded some of these people were, and said, we should have this Chinese information coming to Europe at that time. Even if he himself did not master Chinese language, he at least was aware that Europe could learn from it. Moreover, there is another bourgeois, and he wrote to Bertin. He said, you really want to know what is written in the Gazette? I will translate you 3 months of it. And he translated 3 months of the Gazette, complete translation, which can be found as a manuscript in Paris. All these sources are available. And you can see here Qianlong a year. Let me come to a conclusion. I tried to approach this topic from two perspectives. The first was looking at a culture from the periphery, the other interconnected cultural history. I hope that I was able to show you how these European sources are, of course, not the only sources, but at least they also expand the knowledge about the Gazette, and of course also the knowledge about how Europeans were reading the Gazette in China itself. Moreover, it was an interconnected history. Instead of only looking at the Gazette, what happened in China, we saw how it was distributed in Europe, but also was read in Europe, and how people started to think about European issues from the perspective of China. And that is my final conclusion. Through the translations of this Gazette, that gave European readers access to knowledge about the Qing art of governing they would otherwise have been denied. If we did not have these translations of the Gazette, probably they would not have known so much about it. Already in the 18th century, Chinese Gazette joined a global public. Thank you very much for your attention.
Interesting and also insightful lecture on intercultural, history and cultural exchange between Europe. And you see Europe as a global public already, even though maybe some people. So far, I think we have from the Zoom, I think a lot of people, but no question raised. So I think here we leave the opportunity for the live audience. We have only 15, 20 minutes, I think. If you like to raise a question, please raise your hand, and then also could you tell us also your name and also briefly,
Good afternoon. Okay. Thank you, Professor Sander. Thank you, Professor Yang. I want to, this is Pen. I graduated from the university in the political science. And last year, introduced about your topic as a sample. I want to ask you one question on the perspective of politics. You know that politics is about the interact, and this is very key point between the two countries or two, between China and Europe. Europe is pretty right topic in the perspective of intellectual or philosophy. I still want to be in the politics. Yeah. So I want to know how the Jinbao, Dibao influence the political decision from Europe to China. You know that Magari is a diplomatic journey to Qing dynasty. This is very this is a very important event. But from the time, at that time, the European countries can get the Dibao on time. Yeah, so I want to use Volta and the Moscow as example. But I want to know how it influence that in the diplomatic event just between the two countries or two political institutions. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, the diplomatic relationships.
Yeah.
Let's say I'm not often using the word influence because for me it's a kind of interaction from which certain things emerge, and so it's not that you have the gazettes and that has a direct influence on politics. No, it creates a sphere of information where ideas start to circulate. Now, I must say that I'm not very well aware to what extent the McCartney expedition was within these discussions related to the Qingdao. I don't know, that should be investigated. What I know is that you have here Bertin, and so that's the Qianlong, especially the Qianlong period, and because earlier in the Yongzheng period, that's more these intellectual discussions. For the later period, so we are talking about the 70s, 80s until the 1790s, so about 20 years, an important figure was Henri Bertin. And Henri Bertin has direct link to a direct access to the French king. And you have commercial exchange with China. And they are related to this commercial exchange. And so in the text, the manuscript text used by Bertin, he will say, can you write me a little bit more about that person? The cover of my book has a picture of one of the officials. So Bertin asked, can you send me designs of these people? One of them in the south was condemned. And then he said, what happened with this person? So you have this kind of, let's say, direct links. And I think that this created an atmosphere, at least for France, where there was a lot of openness to contacts with China. I gave the example of the idea that he wanted to have a copy of the Sekochuanchu. But at that time, you did not have French, let's say, delegation in the same way as the McCartney expedition to China. So it's a rather general answer in the sense that you create a whole atmosphere of knowledge, but I did not investigate the direct link.
All right, there's a hand over there.
Thank you so much, Professor. And you mentioned about some general thoughts about Chinese administration system at the time. And I wonder, are there any very specific events or issues that maybe reported in the debate? And what the Europeans at that time knew those very specific events? I never read debate, but I understand Shilu. And there are so many different issues. Yeah, and it's my question.
Could you also identify yourself? Your name?
My name is Chen Xingyan, and I'm the graduate of the history department.
All right.
Yeah, so there are many different topics in it. I mentioned only a short list for the Yongzheng period, but these are 300 pages. In my book, I have 60 pages only identifying all the different topics, and they go in political events, they go in cultural events that can go about the famine. You have a whole part in the manuscript about the war and the conflicts in Taiwan, for instance. A very interesting section about that. So yeah, you have a lot of information that is used and sent to Europe about it. But then you also have this, let's say, more bureaucratic or information. So these are translations, but the Amiot or Contensin and so on, they also give information about the functioning of the Chinese bureaucracy. So there is a very long text on the system of the examination system. And you have these records of all every 3 months, they published a list with all the changes in the positions of the important officials. Every 3 months that was published in Chinese. And some of these copies were sent to France, and at least one should have been translated. I did not find the translation, but and all this to inform the Bertin, the advisor of the French king, to see here, look at how the Chinese bureaucracy works.
Can I find those France primary sources on the website?
Well, we have a book exhibition, I think, in our library at this time. And then we do have some old books published, the manuscripts published in European languages. I'm not sure we have all the cassette translation.
You have the website of the French National Library, Gallica.
I have this.
Yeah, and there you'll find a lot. But not all the Chinese sources have been digitalized. So then, you have to go to France. It's a nice trip.
Thank you so much, Professor.
And then you have also Latin, Spanish, and German, and all these languages. Professor Faure?
Thank you very much for the detailed reconstruction. Passage home. But the experience I focus on the essays equation. Would you not be guilty of overloading things? Because the Europeans were not only getting information from the email, they already knew quite a lot from Chinese sources, and they had years of knowledge accumulated from the Jesuit missions to China. So your newspaper knowledge from China is really being overlaid on a very, very solid background already. So if you take that into consideration, where would you put the data, the sort of knowledge you're talking about today?
So I think you're right that it is somehow overloaded, and that's part of the survey I made. I started to, is this used, and then I just, was it also distributed, and then was it also received? And then of course I only focused on the references of the Gazette, for instance in Voltaire, and Voltaire writes much more about China and also from other sources. And so I completely acknowledge that it's part of, I would say even a fun, a fun survey that you really follow one line. The idea behind was basically nobody had written about did Europeans use the Gazette and what happened with that. And then you start to discover all these links. But that's also a bit the limit of the research. Where do we have to situate it in for the Enlightenment, I would say? There I would still say that you have Description de la Chine, in which you have much more than only the Gazette. But these 3 letters by Contensin, they provide so much information about the daily activities of an emperor that you do not find in the same way in other printed sources. And so the missionaries sometimes express their own functioning within the palace and their relationship with the emperor, but that's more in private letter than in published letters. So in that regard, the discussions about what is that now, despotism or not, is still to a large extent based on this relatively few sections of sources, the 3 letters by Contensin, and the description in Description de la Chine. Of course, when we talk about, let's say, Chinese morality, there are other texts in Description de la Chine. When we have about, let's say, the arts and the techniques and technology, you have other sources. But the more political there, the importance of the Gazette is still quite high. I don't dare to say how much percentage or so, but it's quite significant.
Well, any more questions? I think the cultural history between China and 17th or 18th century Europe, we will this lecture focus only on the Gazette and the translation of the Gazette, but also we know the volumes of Jesuit correspondences will provide more information, but not exactly on the activities of the emperor, and also the question of who, even life persons or servants of Jesuits, could also be the passage, I think, through which I think that China and Europe inform each other. If there's another question, I think your political question. Okay, we have Dr. Lee.
My name is from Stanford University. My question probably is not directly related with 17th, 18th century, but there is a shift of opinion about China from a positive way to a negative way between the 18th century and 19th century. And the source of your knowledge probably was a crucial factor behind this shift. And what do you think is the reason behind this shift about Chinese culture and Chinese government, Chinese system?
I must say that I'm quite impressed by the book by Oster Hamel, which I mentioned, who is not only looking at China, but at the whole of Asia, So from, let's say, the Middle East until the Far East, to the extent that we can use these words. And he noticed that around 1800, there is a kind of shift from an inclusive Eurocentrism to an exclusive Eurocentrism. So Europe has been Eurocentric, but before 1800, there is a kind of interests and activities and publications that is inclusive in the sense that, even if we look at it from the perspective of Europe, we want to learn from the others. And that's what happens with China also. And that suddenly they say, oh, and we have to learn that and look at what China is doing. Now, for me, the crucial period, now when I focus on Europe, the crucial period is between the McCartney expedition and, let's say, the 1839 and the Opium War. In that period, what happens? So McCartney goes to China, and Chen Emperor basically says, we don't need what you bring us. And to a certain extent, he was right, because he had a supertension, he had a bureaucracy, there were problems, but that worked quite well. He had the economy, there were problems, but that worked quite well. Europe was looking and saying, he had palaces with reproduction of even Versailles. He had paintings, everything you more or less wanted. I'm exaggerating a bit, but that's to enter into his mind. But then, after this McCartney expedition, it's not due to McCartney expedition. You have to look at what happens in Europe. You have the French Revolution. You have the Napoleonic Wars. So Europe is in war at that time. There are hardly any missionaries coming to China. There is the development of the industrialization that starts. There is the whole idea of progress. There is the applied sciences that enter in modern universities. They are no longer Renaissance, they are no longer, but a new concept of universities. All this is happening in a period of about 40 years, more or less, in which China and Europe have very few contacts. And then the British come back with steamships, no longer the other ships. And so you have the whole idea of progress, steamships and trains. And there they come to China, and with the Opium War, they impose themselves, which is another story. But what happens is that this kind of world vision or culture and so, and I look now from the perspective of China, no longer fits with the Chinese traditional culture, because the bureaucracy, the examination system, to which the Europeans looked and they admired them. What you need in that new society is to learn languages. You need investors to make your train system. You need engineers. You cannot say, okay, you learn the classics by heart during 30 years, and then no, you need completely different. And there is also a shift that took place not only with China but with other parts in the world, where the more positive view changes in a negative view, or a view to say, what can China tell us? So it's this kind of conflict that happened in a period of about 40 years.
Okay, I understand. Professor Fogg.
I mean, despite what you say, Osterham already missed the point to use his own word. Osterham, whom you were citing, hasn't he missed the point to use his own word? The one thing you have not mentioned in those 30 years is that absolutism had fallen out of favor in Europe. After Napoleon.
Absolutely.
Absolutism no longer controlled the press. Wouldn't that have been the bigger shift?
Well, I think it's one of the shifts that took place. Yeah, you have a new concept also of I'm from Belgium, and that was at that when we are a very young state, and that's 1830, and that was constitutional parliament, a constitutional parliament. So it's not the king who is the most important; it's the parliament. That was very, very modern at that time, where you have all these different new, but all this comes together because it's economy, it's also with Napoleon besides the war, but you have the Napoleonic Code, which regulates the whole administration until today. So these are really new concepts of a society that brings the whole thing in another balance.
All right, time is almost up. So I think if anyone would like to ask the last question, if you want, gives you another minute. No?
No, sir. Sorry about it. I think my question is very different. That is, on the start of your lecture, I remember you mentioned 1800 is a very important year, right?
That period.
So I mean that you mentioned people deal with the document after the 1800, and then you want to share the way to deal with the materials, right? So I want to know that what is the specific skills details about the two previous materials, and how you deal with that specifically. Yeah.
So it is not the year 1800. It is around 1800 because for instance, the Tito Shitian that goes until I think 1805 or 1815, and so it's around that period. The point is that from the, let's say, the Western European point of view, is that regarding to the Gazette, we have many European English sources because from the 1830s, many of them are translated into English. And that is related to the existence of the Qingpao. So that coincidence. Before that, I thought there were no translations, and you have a different type of Tipao, which is not the Qingpao, but which is the Tito Chuanlu and the Tito Shitian. So that makes, regarding to my topic, the difference. But in order to do that, and that's a methodological question, inspired also by this Professor Pan. So we often have to forget about the Qingpao. What I did in the beginning, I had the Qingpao in mind, but sometimes you have to say, no, I forget about it. And I try to find what was specifically for the period before. So that's kind of methodological way of doing. Forget about what we have in our mind.
All right, just a piece of information. I think at CUHK, I think we have a translation department. We have a research team working on the relationship between history and also the translated material, starting with 1780s, 1790s, the Macaulay mission, led by Professor Wangji, I think Lawrence Wang. I think they published several volumes already.
Very good.
So, but then the Q&A and the dialogue could continue on for forever, and you still have your chance, because Professor Standard will be delivering the second lecture and the third lecture, and the second one on Friday and the third one on Sunday. So we like to show our appreciation and our thanks to him for today's very first lecture. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Professor Standard and Professor Learn for this inspiring lecture. And thank you all again for coming. Professor Standard will be delivering 2 more lectures on Friday in CUHK and Sunday at the Hong Kong Central Library. So please feel free to come again. You can find the details of the lecture in the booklet. And lastly, please help us to fill out the questionnaire by scanning the QR code on the screen. Thank you and look forward to seeing you again in the future.
Testing 可以 testing 你可以呢度咧，但係頭先就冇咯，即係呢度都有跳咯。頭先講喺呢度嚟㗎，有幾遠啊？嗰時收得好清楚。我頭先就係咁啊，係咯，頭先喺呢度咁樣都收到啊嘛。testing， 我就唔用 clip 咪咯。嗰陣時我哋夾喺度㗎嘛，即係就算唔咩嘅話，我哋夾喺度都應該收得好好㗎，所以我先至覺得好奇怪。而家一齊試緊咯，因為我呢 cut 我可以 cut 啊嘛。testing 係收晒佢，可以收。testing。hello， 冇聲嘅咩？有咯喎，頭先係冇嘅喎，頭先係好細咯，頭先而家都好細啊。但係嗰陣時我哋叫佢哋啲講者係咁樣 clip 喺度，即係以前未有呢個嘅時候係 clip 喺度嘅喎。
我係覺得咧白色兩隻係虧啲，
兩冇所謂嘅，總之。